The attitude of our species is that this whole thing was created for us. It has no value except how we use it. And the basic problems in American society is a rights society, not a responsibility society. Having religious places or revolving your religion around that means that you are always in contact with the earth. You're responsible for it and to it.
Welcome to Sacred Land Speaks, where we dive into the audio archives of the Sacred Land Film Project and revisit the interview clips we left on the cutting room floor over 40 years of filmmaking. I'm your host, Toby McLeod. Today we're re-airing part 2 of my rare interview with the legendary Standing Rock Sioux author and activist, Vine Deloria Jr. from 1997. Vine Deloria Jr.'s books, Custer Died for Your Sins and God is Red, had a big impact on me as a university student, and were largely responsible for setting me on my path as a filmmaker, telling stories of indigenous people fighting to protect sacred sites. But more importantly, his writing, teaching, and organizing forever changed our world. Vine Deloria impacted a generation of scholars and Native leaders who are continuing his work, protecting sacred landscapes, and asserting tribal sovereignty. It was one of the great honors of my life to interview him at his home for our documentary In the Light of Reverence. Vine died in 2005, and there aren't many interviews with him that are available to the public. Our conversation lasted more than 2 hours, and we only used 2 minutes of it in the film, which is astounding to me now because in those 2 short minutes, Vine became the intellectual guide for viewers as we navigated the complexities of Native American sacred sites and ceremonies. In this podcast, we're reviving the extensive analysis and history he shared. Part 1 covers his thoughts on one particular sacred site battle at Devil's Tower in Wyoming, which we portrayed in the film. But in this episode, I'd like to share more of Vine's broader philosophy. When I interviewed Vine in 1997, it was still just the beginning of the internet, email, and digital era. Smartphones weren't popular until a decade later, but Vine was already sounding the alarm about the dangers of ever more sophisticated and mesmerizing technology.
I think technology has been the death of our species. I mean, we are going to become extinct. And that is, technology allows you to mechanically extend your capabilities. You know, telephone lets you talk to people 500 miles away when they would be in voice range. A car allows you to travel where you'd have to walk. So as you have those mechanical things, that just pries you loose from relating to the earth. And it goes on and on and on. Pretty soon you're totally abstract. What we do to make a living in the United States now is we move paper from desk to desk. It has nothing to do with the world or reality. So there's no way to stop it because it's useful to individuals, and millions of individuals make a decision, and this kicks technology into a higher gear. And we don't really know what we're doing now. But we have more of these labor-saving devices which take away our time, so we have no time. And it's going to be the death of us, sooner or later. And the whole thing just going to melt down. Or it's going to drive people crazy. They're just going to get out in the streets, start shooting each other. I don't think you can take the psychological pressure of being in a situation where you start out a human being, you start adding these extensions to yourself, and finally you find yourself part of the machine, and there's no way to get out. And I don't think people are built for that psychologically. I think it's going to blow.
As we endure recurring news of mass shootings and the mental health crisis sweeping the nation, I can't help but feel that Vine foresaw this future. His clarity came from his work as a lawyer, theologian, and scholar, analyzing Native people's subjugation by settler colonial laws, which are so contrary to the spiritual practices of America's First Nations. He grounded his analysis in history, and explained how current-day problems are rooted centuries ago in the conduct of Christian missionaries who promoted individualism.
Well, the first real suppression is a twofold thing. The Jesuits and other Catholic orders in the Great Lakes area came in, saw these Indian medicine men doing these things, and tried to compete with them. And, of course, they were successful partially because they brought European diseases, and they brought European medicine, so you can cure a disease if you know its cure. They couldn't do a lot of things a medicine man could do, particularly out-of-body travel and things. So you have their records just filled with this stuff. So Catholics really worked hard, and they got a lot of those tribes in the Great Lakes to finally become Catholics, based on the fact that the Indians believed that somewhere the whites must have spiritual powers because they had all this great technology. See, that's the one side. And the other is the Protestants from Plymouth Rock on were determined to convert Indians. See, the tendency of Christianity is not to convert the family, but to convert the individual. They're proud of saying, once you become a Christian, you even forsake mother and father and all that to become a Christian. So you have this continual sniping at the family structure. And you got terrible incidents. Most of the big massacres of Indians are massacres of peaceful Christian Indian villages by frontiersmen. They're not the army. So you come out with the Plains Indians, and they have all these ceremonies designed to keep families and groups together. And they start attacking those institutions. And such things as the giveaway. They go and they say, no, you mustn't give these things away, that you must accumulate them. And the Indians would say, well, but I got all these relatives. I can't accumulate all this. People would think I was selfish. No, you've got to look out for yourself. And Red Cloud has this incredible quote in D. Brown's book, steal everything you can, accumulate it, and lock it so no one can get it. So there was an introduction. You got speeches at Lake Mohawk conferences. So we got to introduce selfishness into these tribes. And so what you began to have was, as people intermarried right on the edge of those tribes, the mixed bloods didn't really know which way to go. They were more accepted by white society because they had white blood, and they were needed by Indians because the full bloods didn't understand how to deal with the whites. So that's where you got a lot of your converts, and people were just totally ambivalent, and with good reason. So once the missionaries got in, then they went around attacking all kinds of ceremonials. A lot of people that I think really don't know the history too well complain about the loss of the Sundance, that people were doing the Sundance. But you can trace that back 100 years, and you find it was an entirely different Sundance. As the political pressure became harder on the plains, a lot of people thought they had to increase the sacrifices of blood and flesh in order to keep the spirits on their side. So it became increasingly brutal, it became increasingly physical. But originally it was much more benign, and it took much more prayer and meditation, a different thing. The Pipestone Quarry, which was the location that tribes traveled to get their pipes, all over the continent came to Pipestone Quarry. They said if you came to the Pipestone Quarry, when you approached about 10 or 12 miles away, if you were supposed to go in there, the sky would cloud up, and there'd be a slight rain, not much, but just enough to soften and wet the ground. And once you saw that sign, then you could go in there, and all the tribes respected that. So the missionaries would urge the government to go destroy things like that. They'd say, this is devil worship, whatever. So they put a railroad right through the middle of the shrines, thinking that would help them convert the Sioux. But of course, Iowas and Otos and Sac and Fox and Chippewa and all kinds of tribes then got deprived of the use of that place. The Sioux were able diplomatically to get the government to say it belongs to you alone, but it really belonged to all the tribes. It was a very spooky place.
Vine laid out the progression of the settler colonial assault on indigenous culture and family through the dictates of Christianity, which focused on attacking the ceremonial life of tribes, as he just mentioned, and also the physical destruction of sacred places.
Then when they got them on the reservations, I think the thing that really broke stuff up, because you could still do sweat lodges. I mean, people were doing sweat lodges all the way along. You could still, out in the obscure parts of the reservation, do your weepies. But they had this ceremony called the keeping of the soul. And this was as part of the funeral. They would cut pieces of hair from the body. And they'd prepare a medicine bundle, and then they'd keep this bundle in the house or in the tent. And this would go on for about a year after the person died. And they would treat it as if the person hadn't died. And they would give them water, and they'd give them food at the meals, talk to them, and offer smoke to them. Now, this was to remind everybody that we don't just live a totally material life and then die and become atoms. And we come from a long generation of people who are still watching us. And we are supposed to live up certain standards while we're alive. And that there needs to be a period of transition for that soul, where the soul can both relate to the people who've gone before and still communicate to the living. I see, if you just think about it, a person in isolation, all they have is their own thoughts. And what you need is input from other people. That's what really makes personality and knowledge or anything like that. See, that's to assist the soul in making the adjustment and to remind the family they too are going to go through this. Well, of course, some missionaries lost it. I mean, they just were livid. They said, don't you know when you die, you go straight to heaven with Jesus and are issued a harp and start playing Amazing Grace and whatever. And so the major thrust was attacking first the family, then the ceremonies that made the family what it was, made it strong. And then they moved to public dancing and other things. And they, of course, called every dance a war dance. If the Indians are dancing, this means trouble. And so it was very difficult. I mean, the Pueblos, were really oppressed because they have all these agricultural ceremonial year. It requires dances in different places. And a missionary, in late in 1966, a Catholic priest tried to pour cement on the plaza in Isleta Pueblo to stop the dancing. And all they're saying is, you dance barefooted, and you're taking your energy and through dancing with your feet on the ground, you're putting that back in to help the earth. And Indians knew that the earth was not inexhaustible. And it helped them know more about the universe, so they had to take the energy generated by the new knowledge and put it back into the earth, so the earth, everything will be all right. So when they tried to get rid of all those ceremonies that kept families together, that's really where most of the religion broke down, see, because you try and get an uncle or a distant relative to come name you, and they say, no, you can't do that. We've already baptized this person as Hezekiah, whoever. And at the funerals, people would bring clothing and food to put on the grave. They say, no, this is superstition. That spirit's not going to stay around. That person's long gone. It's already with Jesus. And it was really funny that my dad was an Episcopal minister, an Episcopal missionary out there, and he had fights with the white clergy continually over their funeral customs. And he almost hit them a couple of times because he'd always allow the people to come bring all the traditional things. See? When they'd have joint funerals, I hear the white clergy would say, you can't put oranges on that grave. And so finally he just blew up and he said, look, in white funerals, you dump all these flowers on the grave. You think the spirit comes up and smells those flowers, or what? So, what the people are doing, they're giving food, is no different than what you're doing. And you put the guy's favorite dog or his Congressional Medal of Honor in the grave or whatever. He said, that's all these people are doing. They don't have to believe they go straight to heaven. I was on the Episcopal Church Executive Council. I had to fight some of those battles. And to give you the idea of cultural blindness, the Shoshones from Fort Hall had Episcopal mission out there. And they wanted the graveyard as far away from the church as they could, maybe about a mile away. And so the missionaries asked why, and they said, well, the ghosts of the people, you're not allowing us to do the funeral ceremonies the old way. So those spirits wander around that graveyard. They're disoriented. We don't want to go there at night. We don't want to have evening services, ceremonies. And so some of the church bureaucrats said, this is outrageous. We can't have these people tell us this kind of thing. So I said, well, wait a minute. The only reason you have the graveyard close to the church is your own belief in the Middle Ages that the devil was going to come around the graveyards and pick up all these souls. And so you had to bury people as close to the reserved sacrament in the church as possible. That's the only reason you have graveyards near the church. It makes no difference whatsoever. So all you're looking at is two different kinds of belief and experience. What you see, since the Middle Ages, even whites have forgotten the basis for their own behavior. So now we're just caught in this bureaucratic trap of, what's the best practical, secular thing to do.
In addition to tirelessly advocating for Native people's right to continue following their traditional practices, Vine had to constantly explain the significance of Indigenous people's relationship to place and responsibility to place as fundamental cultural values and the heart of spiritual practice.
Throughout history, people have found sacred places on the earth. I mean, there's shrines all over. All kinds of religions have shrines. Depending on the manner in which the religion hooks to some kind of reality, those shrines become increasingly important. Some have healing powers, some prophetic powers, some others. Against that then comes Judaism and Christianity, which say, well, there's one God. The God is working in history. Everything we're doing is not only foreordained, but this is the way it should be. And to tie yourself to one place is to deny what history is. Now, the problem with that is you always have to make progress in that history. You can't have dark ages, and you can't go downhill. It must always get better and better. And history itself is too erratic to make that kind of judgment. So what you have is just total destruction of different land areas, and then action kind of moves to the next area, ruins that. It's ironic, St. Francis is the patron saint of Catholic ecologists, but point of fact, the guy encouraged the ruin of all the wetlands in Europe by filling in all the creeks and little ponds. So I think it's a real tough philosophical question overall about, who are we and what does it really mean to be a human being? And where do we come from? Where are we going? And we have plenty of phenomena to examine, but we also have this tradition of all these religions saying, don't even ask the question, or we already know. So you end up in a really difficult situation. Place, idea of having religious places or revolving your religion around that means that you are always in contact with the earth. You're responsible for it and to it. In the history, you're just responsible to your peer group or whoever the power elite is at that time, because they're making history. So it becomes a matter of time-based religions become wholly irresponsible. I remember when James Watt was sworn in as Secretary of Interior, they asked him, do you believe Jesus is coming back? Yes, I do, and we better get everything paved before he does. And you think, good Lord. And so the question of, we're renewing cities, but we don't seem to have any sense that we should be renewing lands and rivers and things.
This contrast between Western religions needing to demonstrate progress through time versus indigenous spirituality that embodies a cyclical relationship with place was a real challenge for me at first. Once I began to understand the deep roots indigenous peoples have in their home territories, I felt the pain and loss of the U.S. government's relentless policy of forced removal. Vine explained how the earth itself falls out of balance when indigenous people are torn away from their ancestral homelands and sacred places.
So you move people off, then that closes off, breaks the relationship between the powers that exist in that spot and the peoples and their ability to go back and keep communing with them. A number of tribes will live more toward mountains, have ceremonies called world renewal ceremonies, and they're supposed to do this, not that they in one ceremony remake the world, but they contribute to the feeling of the cosmos that everything is proceeding in a regular manner. And you see, without the cosmos, since it is personal, without it feeling it's doing a good job, it gets depressed too and says, to hell with it, see? And then comes all the catastrophes. So you just cut off the spiritual life of people and cut into their emotions a great deal. And then you cut into their concern for each other. And see, all the tribes had clan or kinship responsibilities. How you treat your family, how you treat the other people, how you treat strangers. And this becomes quickly very callous if you don't have those rituals continuing. You know, there's no set formula for the rituals because each medicine man has his experience, which helps him interpret how you do those things. And so it becomes a matter of always tailoring the ritual or the ceremony to the people that are actually there. Now, you see, that's different than Western religion. Western religion, if you go bury someone, you turn to page 82 and start reading these prayers. And they are comforting and everything, but you never have that feeling that other entities are participating. So if you move people off, then the tendency, quite a ways away from their land, the tendency over about 3 generations is to try to re-sanctify a central location where they're at. So you'll find people in eastern Oklahoma identifying places in Oklahoma and Arkansas as critical places for Cherokees and Choctaws and others, because they know it's not the original place back in the South. They know they have to center themselves. First step in keeping the community together, see? But non-Indians experience this all the time. They don't seem to reflect on it. We sit here in Golden, and this becomes center of the universe for our next week. We're going to go north to do something. We're going to go east to do something. What they're saying is, if your only experience is the necessity to always refocus yourself at any place, and you're totally lost. You've got to have that sacred place to. So you're doing things in reference to that. You're doing secular things in reference to it.
Even though Vine often painted a bleak picture of the lost sense of place and shared heritage that resulted from colonization, Christianization, and forced removal, he was always looking for solutions.
Identifying and giving respect to a sacred place, then I think establishes on a very fundamental level your conception of what the universe is. And so you always have that place near you or staring you in the face or easy access to it. And then I don't think are as disrupted in terms of social change around you. And I think the respect for that gets you to appreciate other secular parts of the location, so that gradually you're building in the sense of being indigenous. If people could sit still long enough to attach themselves to a place and then think about, this is my home. I mean, cosmically my home, not where I was born. This is where our family must return, no matter how scattered we are. This is special as close to any other place. You can begin to build rather fast into that, but most people don't know where their grandparents are buried, let alone where they're going to be buried. So all these graveyards are a whole bunch of strangers, have nothing to do with each other. And you'd be surprised that even the Christian Indians still maintain that ferociously. And every now and then I have to contribute money to a cemetery down in Greenwood where all my distant relatives are buried, see. But you go there and you see those names and you say, this is really where I'm from. So a sacred place will do that. And of course, a lot of times they put their bodies out on scaffolds, and after the flesh had decayed and everything, or just bones, they'd gather them in a bundle and they'd take them to one of these places. Almost everyone in relation to that location would have their own story or their family story about what it was. And that would be the shared heritage of the whole group. And we need to have shared heritages in American communities.
In order to heighten that sense of shared heritage, Vine looked to the healing provided by traditional ceremonies.
I think the thing that really saved Indians for a long time, and that's one of the things we have to bring back, is when they do those puberty ceremonies and vision quests and things, part of the idea was to find out what you were supposed to do in this lifetime. And a lot of times the prophecies are right down the line. I mean, some of the great chiefs, you can just point out parts of their vision. So you had a sense of vocation. You weren't here just to consume or have a good time. You had a sense of responsibility, and you knew who you were. In fact, you knew who you were, and then during the course of your life, you'd pick up all these different names. So some people had half a dozen names, but those names were given when people in the community saw that you'd made certain steps in maturing personality. And so you had different names. So they were keenly aware of what the individual was supposed to do. They never disrupted it from community. And you look today, there's no community, and individuals are just treated like interchangeable units. So we don't have a society, we have a social machine.
While Western religions like Christianity proselytize and aim to convert, traditional indigenous practitioners just want their religion to be respected. As a lawyer, Vine frequently defended Native Americans' right to practice their religion free from government interference.
You're not talking about a high population area. You're talking about a religion that does not want to be a public religion. It wants simply the privacy to go off and do certain things without being disrupted. And that seems to pose the biggest threat in the world to the government. If you're to say, well, we're going to have a big rally here in Yosemite and 500,000 kooks for Jesus are going to come sing hymns for 3 days, I think it was wonderful. So you get religion as kind of silly participation rather than serious ceremonial. So all of these strands are woven in there. You read the recent Supreme Court decisions on Indian religion, they're mostly emotional responses of conservative people to religious ideas they don't understand and a frantic search to find some statute that will deny that religious existence.
Throughout the expansion of the United States, settlers found ways to attack Native spiritual practices. The 1883 Code of Indian Offenses banned Native dancing and ceremony, punishable by imprisonment and the withholding of government rations. But Vine pointed out that the legislation also replaced Native governance.
Well, see, a lot of people think the government passed all kinds of federal statutes. What they did was try and institute their own form of government on the reservation. And that was to elect a council and appoint police and judges, and they were going to rule the reservation. And they tried that. In some places they were successful, others they weren't. But what they did was brought in Anglo law. Then the agents had the power to determine what was legal and what wasn't. And the missionaries pressured the agents, and they got certain things prohibited, say. And so that's the way it was done. I get inquiries all the time from scholars, send me all these religious statutes. I don't know, but what someone might have raised the religious freedom question if this thing had come out in the open. But to give you an example, when the Comanches were doing their Native American church ceremonies in western Oklahoma, there was a BIA inspector called Pussyfoot Johnson. And he would sneak around trying to catch these people at peyote meetings, and he'd arrest them on alcohol statutes and just harass the hell out of them. While he's doing this, the commissioners in Washington saying, no, we're giving religious freedom to Indians, we're not intruding. And newspapers got a hold of it, and they said, well, here you got this guy arresting these people. The commissioner didn't even know. It was a low-level bureaucrat, took it on himself to. This raised the whole peyote question that really wasn't settled till a couple of years ago. And the whole thing, it's not that the Congress deliberated and said we're going to do these bad things to Indians. It was that the Congress exercised no oversight on what the Bureau was doing. It never has and never will. And so the bureaucrats were free to do whatever they want.
After more than 100 years of suppression, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, or ARFA, was enacted in 1978 to protect the rights of Native Americans to exercise their traditional religions. These rights include freedom to worship in ceremony, the right to possess sacred objects, and access to sacred sites. Very quickly, there were legal challenges, and there are still struggles to have these basic human rights understood and protected, especially when it comes to sacred cultural landscapes.
ARFA was one of the feel-good resolutions and policy changes that came out of the response to Wounded Knee. So originally it was just to have government agencies be extra sensitive to Indian religious concern. And the problem was a lot of tribes had worked out informal arrangements with some of the government agencies, so they were using these sites anyway. But once they said, you codify this and sensitize your employees and all this, most of these government agencies set up war rooms in case the Indians wanted to use the land and get it back. And so it became just absolute reverse of what anybody expected. And then you got the Rehnquist court. Rehnquist hates Indians, always has. It's just blatant nonsense, his opinions. And they keep stacking the court with more and more conservative people. So there were 3 cases that went up on religious freedom that didn't have to go up at all. The Bowen versus Roy on the Social Security number in Maine, the Northwest Cemetery case in California, and then the peyote case in Oregon. See, Oregon did have a statute, but no one ever enforced it. And then you get in this bureaucratic bind. If you look at it, it's all bureaucrats, see? Then Supreme Court just rules, thumbs down, right straight along. And so I don't at least expect any rational decision out of the Supreme Court till you get a different court. These guys are a reincarnation of the court of the 1890s, 100 years ago. Did Plessy versus Ferguson, all the bad cases on minorities. Same mindset. They probably the same souls are reincarnated. So the courts are not going to do you any good. Well, more important is no one really understood the nature of Indian religion. And the assumption was these people do funny ceremonies, but they're not radically different than what the Christians are doing. So why do they really need this anyway? And there's great skepticism throughout the government. What are we going to do? So there was a movement to add muscle to the ARFA thing. But the problem was, I think, on the Indian side, we had not devised the proper means of communicating. You fought the peyote issue, and the fight was whether it was a drug or not. When I gave testimony in Portland, I said, now, what you got to look at is this is the natural use of a natural substance. That you harvest the peyote off the cactus, and you don't process it, or you don't do any chemical thing to it. You use it as a natural plant. It's part of the plant. You go to cocaine, heroin, all of these, you take the poppy or something else, you process this thing and create a new drug. And so peyote shouldn't be in the drug at all. And I couldn't get a lot of people representing the Indians to start to make those kind of arguments. See? And what the arguments they're making were, well, this is similar to the communion wine, and in a way it is. But what people on the other side could then argue is the communion wine doesn't make you hallucinate or all that. And then the response should have been, this is not hallucinations. We're capable of, all of us are capable of seeing the larger context of life, which involves music becoming sound and sound becoming music, colors becoming sound. And you see, in science, we use microscopes to look at stuff we could never see. We use telescopes. We're extending the range of our knowledge because we're able to see things. Bob the dog can hear a lot more than I can. No one questions that that's part of the universe. But these people keep saying, well, everything peyote does is bad for you. And it was never abused. I mean, you couldn't possibly abuse it because it's such a bitter plant that it's not like popping two peyote buttons and going off having a good time. I mean, it takes a great deal of commitment to belong to that church. And we're just never able to communicate that. So everything we did, we unwittingly allowed to be processed in the Western intellectual context. And so people then saw no reason why, if we were so similar to them, why we needed protection.
Because traditional indigenous people, their cultures, and homelands do not fit into the Western intellectual context, Deloria struggled throughout his career to sort out legal arguments so Native people could be understood and seek justice in settler courts. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court heard the Go Road case in which Native practitioners in Northern California tried to prevent the construction of a logging road through a forest that was sacred to at least 3 tribes. In a devastating ruling showing the weakness of ARFA, the justices determined that the Constitution protects religious beliefs, but not practices rooted in sacred land, especially when the government controls that land.
Well, expectations were raised so high after ARFA, and nobody really knew what ARFA meant. See? And this is the original resolution. And what you had were these weird situations where strong traditional people had been using public lands. We'd go talk to the local BLM manager and say, what do we do now? And he'd say, oh my God, I don't know. My boss wants me to do this and that. And you had a series of cases that started out as environmental cases by environmental action groups. They get in the middle of it and they start losing traction. And you go find an Indian and say, well, God, isn't this valley sacred to Indians? And of course, here's his chance in the limelight. Yes, it is. And the case evolved from something like Sierra Club versus Disneyland, the famous one in Southern California, evolved from that to some kind of Indian religious tradition versus a corporation or the Corps of Engineers. Pitting those two together, you're always going to lose in the federal court. And if you're going to go to litigation, you got to pick what the parties are and what they're going to do to each other and say to each other. And so I used to just get frantic because I'd see, keep track of an issue, and it would be like the little Tennessee River and the snail darter. That started out as to protect snails. All of a sudden, in the middle of it, you got, well, this is also a traditional Cherokee burial ground. Then you got the Cherokees as witnesses giving conflicting testimony. Because I think a lot of those people didn't know why they were there. If you say, is this sacred? Sure it's sacred. Well, Indians got to start making distinctions about what's really sacred and what is respectful, or what is, what helps make our secular identity. So you had a series of losses at the federal district court level or appeal court level. And no one really thought anything was going to go on up. And then this thing goes up. It's already a moot question. The California Wilderness Act, you can't do anything. And suddenly this horrendous decision comes out. These guys reach way out in left field. Indians can't do this. anything an Indian religion would do that would be a burden on any government whatsoever is prohibited. And you say, wait a minute. The only thing you could do in that area was once a year perform a world renewal ceremony, which is a prayer for all mankind. And the government says, we don't want you even to do that. See, I mean, that's not a rational decision. That's not a burden on government. Once you see the way the court constitutes it, I mean, now you got Scalia, a raving right-wing Catholic. And, he would just as soon turn the whole country over to the Jesuits. So people are fooling with things they really don't understand. The Indians have become a symbolic victim/agitator on religious issues.
Recognizing that the Supreme Court's Go Road decision placed the profits of loggers above the rights of Native practitioners, Vine never lost sight of the environmental and cultural destruction caused by corporations.
Corporations ought to be in a separate category, I think. They're originally a device so that the monasteries don't have to pay taxes to the king. And then they become a person in law with the Dartmouth College case. Then they become wholly demonic. See, all the political philosophers neglected the corporation. They said no one will work as hard for an abstract entity as they will for themselves. That wasn't true. Once you leave agriculture and get into business, that corporate form is it. And they're utterly ruthless. I mean, if you think the government lies to you, corporations spend 90% of their advertising budget telling you lies. And each technology allows them to intrude into wilderness areas or undeveloped areas even more. So I think that's going to be really hard to stop. Look at the snowmobile. People didn't used to go tear up the back country until they had snowmobiles and motorcycles. And you see, what you got is each individual saying, well, I have a right to do this. And the basic problem is American society is a rights society, not a responsibility society. If you go to Indians, that used to be a responsibility society. You're responsible for all those people. So corporations are just going to kill us. I mean, they're just raping the east side of the Rockies. You blink and there's a whole new housing development. And I think the attitude now is I don't care what happens because I'm only going to live 30 or 40 useful years as an adult, so I want everything now. So corporations encourage that. You didn't have advertising until the end of the last century. Now half the things we buy are stuff that they talked us into buying. We don't really need them, not essential for life. And even the enjoyable things are mostly not essential for enjoyment. So we're definitely part of the machine. We're the bottom feeders in the ocean. We just consume, and nobody cares about what's going on. But you throw that in with the population, and the population explodes. Why? You get a certain level of economic success, and everybody believes they have to have the same thing. So you got 10 times as many people trying to do the same thing as you ever had. So just like cancer at that point.
Just as Vine warned that technology alienates us from the earth and our humanity, he also foresaw that the more people live in relation to machines, the closer we are to economic crisis and collapse. Always thinking strategically, Vine suggested that the key to survival is stable, healthy communities living responsibly in relationship to sacred lands, thinking 7 generations into the future, and focusing on native sovereignty.
I think absent the big crisis, that the situation will just continue to get worse. Congress pretty well sold out to the big money people. There's very few people of conscience in Congress. And they're content to just keep putting Band-Aids on things. I think conservative tide has kind of played itself out. But the middle got so far to the right while that was going on. It's going to be difficult. And absent a big economic crisis or a major geological crisis or something, I think everything's going to grind down into just a dull grayness and drive people crazy. I really don't see any way out of it. And that's why I've switched a lot of my emphasis in terms of Indian reform to getting Indians to reform their communities. Just be self-sufficient to themselves. And look at sovereignty as learning to speak with one voice rather than being in court talking to states and counties, and to look at negotiation, continuing processes of negotiation rather than litigation or legislation. So it's a different ballgame, and you got to quickly adapt to it. But I think these people just let people starve in the cities and let people with health problems die. I mean, once you get greed as your primary value in society, I don't see how you're going to get it out, absent a crisis that, like the New Deal or depression, makes people look at those things. It takes half a dozen or so people playing different roles to get an issue presented to the public or start to get a movement across. And Indians are just like other Americans. They all of a sudden have a pledge of allegiance to some ideologies. During Wounded Knee, all the activists were down on me about, you ought to be out here at Wounded Knee with us. And finally told some of them, somebody's got to be the lawyers. We can't, every Indian in the world can't jam into Wounded Knee. And in the Means Banks trial, I was on the stand. I got the treaty admitted as the source of motivation. And finally, Russell came up to me and he says, I finally understand we have to play different roles. I said, yeah, that's the only thing that makes sense. Otherwise, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. But I grew up as a mixed blood in a border town. That's who I am. I'm not going to suddenly start using mantan and feathers and all that. You run around. And I really feel sorry for people who suddenly decide they are Indian or know they're Indian and want to emphasize it. And go through all those things.
I felt truly honored that Vine Deloria Jr. shared so much of himself with us in this interview. Diving deeper into our archives, I found a keynote presentation he made in 2002 when we screened In the Light of Reverence at a Sacred Lands Forum with a coalition of Native leaders at the Department of Interior headquarters in Washington, D.C. In his comments after the film, Vine helped us grapple with the common misunderstandings about sacred sites and the challenges around communicating a clear and effective narrative to help protect these important cultural landscapes.
How do we deal with the concept of the sacred? Now, I know many Indians just want to say, well, you can't define it, so let's back off. But I don't think we can back off if we're going to try and get public opinion to deal with us. You can't leave the idea of the sacred to personal preference. One guy likes mountain climbing, one guy likes bowling, one guy likes the stock market, whatever. So what we're facing are opponents who do not understand the sacred and don't understand logic. And what they're going to do is throw scare tactics continually at us. And you saw that throughout the film. Well, if we can't do this, why then the whole world's going to go to hell, etc. I've never understood why Americans buy that kind of logic. Now, how are we going to present the sacred to people who have no idea what's sacred? Not the slightest clue. Closest thing to sacred in this society is the Super Bowl. Because they will move, remember Reagan's second term, they moved the inauguration so it wouldn't conflict with the Super Bowl. See? So we're dealing with that kind of society. And we got to move the concept of the sacred forward very slowly. I'm not saying reveal anything, but we've got to find a language to convince them that the opponents, this is a very serious thing to deal with. I'm going to pressure Toby here in the next few weeks, start on another film. We've got to get at the deeper level even now. But there's talent out there that should be related to us, that should be sharing these battles with us, that's very expert, and we're not using them.
I did go on to make another film and continue to try to take things to the deeper level Vine was calling for. I just wish he were still around to be the intellectual guide in our more recent films. Tune into the next episode of Sacred Land Speaks to hear my 2010 interview with Aboriginal Australian professor Marcia Langton. If you like what you've heard, please rate and subscribe to Sacred Land Speaks on your favorite podcast app. You can also visit sacredland.org to learn more about our films, resources, and suggested actions you can take to protect sacred places. This episode was produced and written by Callie, Shanafelt, Wong, and Toby McLeod. Our film interview with Vine was recorded by Will Parrinello and Andy Black, along with co-producers Malinda, Maynor, Lowery, and Jessica Abbe. Our theme music was composed and performed by Stefan Smith and Charles Johnson. Sacred Land Speaks is brought to you by the Sacred Land Film Project of Earth Island Institute, based in the Lejeune Ohlone territory of Huchiun, otherwise known as Berkeley, California. Thanks for joining us.